Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to go into the specific care guides of watering your Phalaenopsis orchid, your moth orchid. Now these orchids are probably the ones that you see in your big department stores such as Home Depot, Lowe's, even a grocery store like Trader Joe's. The plants are mostly from Southeast Asia and are epiphytic. They do grow in the tops of trees along the tree trunks where the roots will wrap around the tree and feed off of the runoff. They're not necessarily parasitic in terms of feeding off the tree, but they're feeding off the nutrients that are being run off with the humidity and the rain that's being provided. Now, these orchids do enjoy lots of moisture, but on the other hand, they do enjoy plenty of air. So they should be planted or potted in a well-draining and airy mix. You'll probably find them potted in bark, in moss, maybe a mix of bark and moss, and in between some additives such as perlite for some air and water retention and charcoal to assist with purifying the water. Now, you're going to water your moth orchid when the pot is completely dry. One indication that you need to water is silvery roots. These plants will put out a myriad amount of roots in the pot, out of the pot, and when those roots are gray, it's a signal that they do need water. Now, because in most instances you can't see what's on the inside of the pot, I do personally recommend learning the weight of your pot so that you know how it feels when it needs to be watered, which means that it's going to be extremely light, and when it's hydrated and doesn't need water, and it'll have that heaviness. In terms of bark and moss, the appearance of a wet pot is going to be darker, so you'll have the dark brown bark, the darker tanned moss, maybe even brown. And with regard to it being dehydrated and needing a good water, the pot is going to be light again, and the bark will be a lighter brown. The moss will be a very, very light tan, almost yellow, if you will. Now, just like any other plant, you want to water your orchid to keep it hydrated, which is something that is 101 with plant care. One of the things that's special about Phalaenopsis, the moth orchids, is that when you water the roots, they will turn green after being fully saturated with moisture. And once they're green, they can actually photosynthesize and help the plant create energy through that growth season or through whatever growth it's going through. It's not a necessity, but it is a pretty cool trait because I don't know of any other plants that have roots that actually do work aside from bringing the nutrients up to the plant. Another sign that you know you need to water your plant are those wrinkly leaves. So you may notice that your leaves will become wrinkly, bumpy. If you will, they may even start to yellow. Yellowing is sort of a different topic though, because a yellow leaf could just mean the plant is old and dropping an old leaf. But sometimes yellowing can be an indication of too little or too much water. Now, with regard to looking at your leaves for dehydration, let's stick to those wrinkly leaves. Again, because the yellow appearing would be tricky. So wrinkly leaves are definitely a sign of dehydration, and these wrinkles may or may not come back once the plant is actually hydrated. You'll have to look at the new growths coming in. If the new leaves are okay, the new roots are okay, but that old leaf is still wrinkled, it's probably fine. It's just going to drop it soon. With regard to your watering, your frequency, one thing I do want to state before we even get into the frequency of watering, the term overwatering has to do with the frequency. It does not have to do with how much water you're putting in the pot. You should always saturate your pot. The ice cube recommendation and half of teaspoon of water doesn't make sense unless your pot doesn't have any drainage. And you really should grow your orchid in a pot with drainage unless you're a bit more advanced and can understand a wet-dry cycle. But holes in the bottom of your pot will promote that wet-dry cycle, and saturating the pot will promote growth in the orchid. I don't recommend watering with ice cubes or with a teaspoon of water because these techniques are not designed to help the plant thrive. They're designed to keep the plant along so you can kind of enjoy the blooms and shock the plant in and out of there to get it to rebloom and respike. I don't recommend it because you don't know what you're doing to the orchid. Now, jumping back to the frequency of watering, basically it's pretty simple. You want to water more when it's warm, water less when it's cooler. Something that's tricky is what is warm and what's cool. As a rule of thumb, if you're comfortable in your house and you don't feel any type of coolness, the plants are fine. I normally grow in an intermediate warm setting, so my plants on a given on a given day are about between 70, 75. On hot days, it can get up to 80, but even better for me because my nighttime drop will be great and they love a nighttime drop. Now, with regard to the warm and cool season, you are still going to water that pot when it's dry. It's just that the warm and cool season it's going to affect how fast the timing becomes. So normally here, again in the States, the warm season from February to October will indicate more watering. It may not be applicable to you, but normally when it's warmer, you water about twice a week. I've seen some people go up to 3 times, but that pot does dry a bit quicker. Me personally here, I do water about every 4 days between the months of February and October. And in February and October, that's sort of my shift month. So I'm figuring out if the pot is going to be watered in that 2-week span or if it just needs to be watered once a week. But normally by March, it's twice a week, and I just have to figure out when. And again, here in my environment, that's about every 4 days. So it's about twice a week. And then on the contrary, we have the cooler season from October to March, where I slow down the watering to about once a week. Now, I didn't explain this, so let's go back really quickly. But in the warm seasons where the pot is drying and we're watering more, but it's also because the plant is growing. Your Phalaenopsis is going to grow exponentially when it's warm. Now, there are different phals in terms of your novelties with those little star shapes and your standards, the one that you buy in the big box stores with the big flushy blooms. Now, the big standards are going to just grow when it's warm, but the novelties will most likely bloom as well when it's warm. However, we're going to keep them on the same exact treatment because regardless of the bloom or the leaves, the plant is growing and it's moving. Now, let's flip to the cooler season. In the cooler season, all the growth is going to slow down. The one thing that's going to be different is your standard phal is probably going to put out a flower spike. That's going to be another video for another time. But in the cooler seasons, this is when your standard phals are blooming. And this is sort of when the orchid, in terms of itself growing, is slowing down or not growing at all. So you want to slow down that watering because not only is the pot not drying quick, but the orchid is not taking up as much water in the roots. So just always keep that in mind. Now, as a rule of thumb for the cool season, I don't know homes that get below this, but I would recommend not watering the orchid at all if your temperatures fall below 55 degrees, and maybe just giving it a spray on maybe the foliage on the bottom or maybe the top spray. Now, one of the reasons I recommend spraying the foliage is because Phalaenopsis have their stomata located on the bottom of the plant. So it will pick up a nutrient or two, some nutrients at the bottom if you're unable to water the pot. And simply speaking, you're going to water the pot and not the plant in general. So like most orchids, these plants do not like to be wet on the leaves or on the blooms or any of the structures. They like for the roots to have a consistent moisture. So you want to make sure you're running water through that pot. You want to make sure the pot is completely saturated. I don't recommend, a teaspoon of water or like a half a cup or something unless you're growing in an environment that doesn't have, in a pot that doesn't have holes at the bottom. But I don't recommend that because when you're not allowing the water to drain or evaporate quick enough, you can run into challenges of rot and mold and fungus. There are ways around it by putting the amount of water that's needed, but it basically has to be exact in these situations. And you want to have a bit more experience. So you probably would want to experiment with a plant or two before you go and just do everyone in one way in a closed system. Lastly, you can always bottom water from the bottom of a pot if you do have holes in it. And with regard to watering, you can go ahead and use tap if you don't have hard water. Now, I found out that water has a measurement of how many particles are in it, which is called ppm, parts per million. And normally you don't want to have something that's too high in parts per million, because the salts that are in the water, whether we know or not, could break down the media very fast or damage the roots. My water is under 200 ppm, and if yours is, I do suggest going ahead and watering. If you do have a high hard water, I would maybe recommend looking into watering with distilled, maybe getting a reverse osmosis system. If you can, collect rainwater. Even if you have good tap water, you should use rainwater. Rainwater is probably the best. And the last thing I just want to leave you on, it'll be for another video, is fertilization. Phals are heavy feeders, but like all orchids, are slow feeders. So I do fertilize my phals depending on the pot size, which will depend on the root size. So if it's a smaller pot, let's say 4 inches and below, I do add about 1/4 of a teaspoon to the gallon. And if the pot is 4.5 inches or above, I do add a 1/2 teaspoon to the gallon. Again, another video for another time. I just want to leave you with that. And also with my social media handles. For any of you who would like to follow me on social media, I do post almost daily, if not every other day, my orchid journey here, minus the motion picture. I'm gonna put my name up there on the screen. It's The Right Path, which comes from Paphiopedilums, my favorite orchid. And see you next video, guys. Have a wonderful day.